Story number 1. When I moved into my new house, the last thing on my mind was the old shed in the backyard. It was small, wooden, and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I was more focused on fixing up the house, but as time went on, that shade began to catch my attention, especially at night. It started with whispers. I'd be in my bed, about to fall asleep, when I'd hear them. Soft, like someone was talking through a pillow. I thought it was just the wind, or maybe my mind playing tricks after a long day. But night after night, the whispers continued. They seemed to be calling me, luring me toward the shed. My curiosity got the best of me. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the shed. The door creaked as I opened it, and a chill ran down my spine. Inside, it was as expected. Old tools, cobwebs, and dust. But then, my light landed on something unexpected. An old radio sitting on a dusty shelf. It was covered in cobwebs, and it looked ancient. As I stepped closer, the radio suddenly crackled to life. A burst of static filled the shed, making me jump. The dial was moving on its own, searching for a station. I reached out to turn it off, but something stopped me. The static settled, and a faint, indistinct voice came through. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like it was calling out for help. I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. I wanted to run, but I also wanted to know more. I decided to visit the local library the next day, hoping to find some information about the previous owners of the house. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, was an old lady who seemed to know everything about the town. When I mentioned the radio and the whispers, she went pale. She told me about the last owner, Mr. Harold, who was an amateur radio enthusiast. He disappeared without a trace years ago. People said he spent his last days cooped up in that shed, talking to someone through his radio. That night, I lay in bed, thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said. The whispers seemed louder, more insistent. I couldn't sleep. I had to know what was happening. I went back to the shed, the radio still crackling with static. This time, I listened more closely. The voice was clearer now, and it definitely sounded like someone calling for help. It was eerie how real it sounded, like someone was trapped inside the radio. I decided to record the voice, hoping to analyze it later. But the next day, when I played the recording, all I heard was static. No voice. Nothing. It was as if the voice only existed in that shed. I started spending more and more time in the shed, trying to communicate with the voice. I would ask questions, and sometimes it seemed like the voice was responding. It was a man's voice, full of fear and desperation. One night, things took a turn for the worse. The voice became frantic, screaming for help. I panicked and tried to turn off the radio, but it wouldn't budge. The door of the shed slammed shut, and I was plunged into darkness. The screaming continued, louder and more terrifying. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The light flickered on, and for a brief moment, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the shed. I blinked, and it was gone. The radio went silent. I stumbled out of the shed, gasping for air. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Was I imagining things? Was the stress getting to me? The next few days were a blur. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The shed haunted my thoughts. I had to find out the truth. I decided to take the radio apart to see if there was anything inside that could explain what was happening. As I unscrewed the back panel, I found something chilling. A small, old photograph tucked inside. It was a picture of Mr. Harold standing in front of the shed, holding the same radio. His eyes seemed to follow me, full of warning. Story number 2. I remember the day we found the shed. It was an accidental discovery, really. My wife, Ella, and I had decided to spend our anniversary in a quaint, remote farm. We wanted to escape the city's noise, and what could be more peaceful than a farm surrounded by endless fields and a thick forest? The first few days were bliss. We'd wake up to the sound of birds, spend our days exploring the woods, and our evenings by the fireplace. But things changed the day we stumbled upon that old shed, nestled at the edge of the forest. The shed looked ancient, its wood weathered and gray. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the gentle breeze. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a peek inside. The interior was simple, a few gardening tools, some old furniture covered in dust. What caught our attention, though, was the acoustics. Our voices echoed oddly, bouncing off the walls as if the shed was much larger than it appeared. We laughed about it, testing the echoes with silly phrases and songs. But then we heard something that stopped us in our tracks. A voice that wasn't ours, echoing back a conversation we had days ago. It was our voices, arguing. I remembered the argument well. It had been a stupid squabble over something trivial, but it had escalated quickly. We'd made up soon after, but hearing it replayed like this was unsettling. We left the shed, trying to brush it off as a strange acoustic phenomenon, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the farm. It was then that I heard it. Faint whispers coming from the direction of the shed. The next morning, I told Ella about the whispers, but she laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the shed's echo. I tried to convince myself she was right. Yet, something pulled me back to that shed. As I approached it alone, the air felt colder, heavier. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Silence greeted me, followed by a whisper of my own voice, discussing plans for our anniversary. I hadn't spoken those words aloud since we arrived. Panic gripped me. This wasn't normal. I turned to leave, but another echo stopped me. It was Ella's voice, but what she said made my blood run cold. I wish he'd never find out about... The rest of her sentence was muffled, unclear. My mind raced with possibilities. What was she hiding from me? Was our entire relationship a lie? I confronted her that evening, demanding to know what the shed had echoed. Ella looked at me, confusion turning to fear as I described what I'd heard. She swore she didn't know what I was talking about, that she had no secrets. But doubt had seeded in my heart. The next few days were tense. We barely spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. The shed's echoes haunted me, replaying fragments of conversations, some recent, some from the past. Each echo felt like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't solve. One night, driven by a mix of fear and desperation, I decided to record the shed's echoes. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I set up my phone to record and waited outside. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I heard it. Voices, not echoes this time, but a conversation happening inside the shed. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the cracks in the wood, I saw two figures in the dim light. One was Ella, her face twisted in anger. The other was a man I didn't recognize. They were arguing, their voices low and urgent. I strained to hear, catching pieces of their conversation. They were talking about me, about us. Ella was saying things, terrible things, that she never said to me. Accusations, resentments, pouring out of her like poison. I felt sick, betrayed. How could she? How could she pretend everything was fine when she harbored such darkness in her heart? I burst into the shed, confronting them. The man tried to intervene, but I was beyond reason. Words turned to shouts, shouts to shoves. In the chaos, something terrible happened. A push, a fall, a sickening crack. Silence fell like a curtain. Ella lay on the floor, motionless. The man was shouting, but I couldn't hear him over the roar in my ears. I had pushed her. It was an accident, but I had pushed her. Panic set in. The man was trying to call for help, but I couldn't let him. I couldn't go to jail. I couldn't lose everything. In a blind frenzy, I attacked him, my hands finding his throat. When it was over, I was alone with two bodies in the shed that whispered secrets. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think. All I could hear were the echoes of our past, taunting me, condemning me. Story number 3. I never believed the tales about the old shed in the woods until that autumn day. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see it for myself. Walking through the dense forest, the air grew colder, and the path narrowed. The trees seemed to whisper secrets as I passed. Finally, I saw it. An old, weathered shed, standing alone in a small clearing. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I pushed the door open and the hinges creaked. Inside, the walls were lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. The light filtering through the cracks in the wood made the mirrors glimmer. It was strangely beautiful, yet something felt off. I walked closer to a large oval mirror. My reflection stared back at me, but something was different. It wasn't me as I am now, but me from years ago. A child with wide, innocent eyes. I reached out to touch the glass, and my younger self mimicked my movement. Shaken, I turned to another mirror. This time it showed me as an older man, with gray hair and tired eyes. I couldn't believe it. The mirrors were showing different stages of my life. How was this possible? I moved from mirror to mirror, each showing a different version of me. Some were happy, others sad. But then I saw something that stopped me cold. In a small, cracked mirror, my reflection was lying on the ground, motionless. Blood was everywhere. My heart raced. Was this my future? Panic set in. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I turned back to the mirrors, and now all of them showed the same horrifying scene. I screamed, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the shed started to shake. The mirrors rattled against the walls, and the images blurred into a whirl of colors. I closed my eyes, praying for it to end. When I opened them again, I was outside, lying on the forest floor. The shed was nowhere in sight. Had it been a dream? A nightmare? I scrambled to my feet and ran home, not looking back. The image of my possible fate haunted me. Days passed, and I couldn't shake off the experience. I had to know if it was real. Against my better judgment, I went back to the woods. But no matter how long I searched, I couldn't find the shed. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I tried to forget, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the image of my reflection, lifeless and covered in blood, lingered in my mind. Weeks turned into months, and I started seeing things in mirrors everywhere. My reflection would warp, showing glimpses of that day in the shed. I couldn't escape it. It was like the shed had cursed me, showing me a fate I was powerless to avoid. Then one evening, as I was walking home, I took a shortcut through an alley. A group of men jumped out, demanding money. I tried to fight them off, but there were too many. I felt a sharp pain, and then everything went dark. I woke up in a hospital bed. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. I had been stabbed, just like the reflection had shown. But I had survived. It wasn't the end. That's when I realized the shed hadn't shown me my fate. It had shown me a warning. It gave me a glimpse of what could happen, not what would happen.